Good afternoon. Welcome to our semi-plenary session on political philosophy. This year is also Immanuel Kant's 300th year, and I was at a Kant Congress in Bonn a couple of weeks ago where the efficiency of the questions in the panels was extraordinary, so we're going to try to do the same here. If I understand correctly, we have 20 minutes for each speaker, 10 minutes for questions, and then another 15 minutes for a collective discussion at the end. So with nothing, the Kantians didn't even do introductions, but with nothing further, I'll introduce Thomas Hibbs. Tom Hibbs is president of the University of Dallas, his alma mater, with degrees from the University of Dallas and the University of Notre Dame. Hibbs taught at Boston College for 13 years, where he was full professor and department chair in philosophy. Hibbs has written scholarly books on Aquinas, including Dialectic and Narrative in Aquinas, an interpretation of the Summa Contra Gentiles, and a book on popular culture entitled Shows About Nothing. Professor Hibbs's talk this afternoon will be on Aquinas on justice and solidarity. It might be easier to go this way.
If I'm still president, I need to check my bank account. I should be making more money. I'm living the good life now. I think I've already lost a couple minutes, so I better talk fast. Really happy to be part of this panel. Randy and I have known each other for a long time, and Brad almost as long, the new illustrious dean of the Pontifical School of Philosophy. I'm going to do a few things, and this is going to be, as my Notre Dame mentor, David Solomon, used to say, quick and dirty, this talk. So I want to begin briefly with two conceptions of solidarity, two contemporary conceptions of solidarity, mention problems with each of them, then again quickly try to say something about how there are things in Aquinas that can salvage what is valuable in each of those accounts while avoiding the defects. And then finally, I want to say something briefly about why some contemporary social scientists think solidarity is important as a corrective to defects in purely proceduralist modes of interacting, particularly with those in need. The first type. In his book Justice, Michael Sandel describes the sort of bonds that undergird what he calls obligations of solidarity in this way. These are particular, not universal obligations, more responsibilities we owe not to rational beings as such, but to those with whom we share a certain history. Solidarity construed in this way has to do with loyalty to family, friends, country, party, religion. Loyalty is particular and often exclusive. Sandel adds that these obligations do not depend on acts of consent. Their moral weight derives instead from the situated aspect of moral reflection, from a recognition that my life story is implicated in the stories of others. The danger with this form of solidarity is that it can be seen as insulating local and even national cultures from criticism. As Sandel notes, solidarity in this form can justify the practice of collective selfishness. Local communities and traditions are bearers not just of good things, but also of evil. We can be loyal to the wrong things. Indeed, loyalty can blind us to our own blindness. We can affirm what is false and celebrate what is deplorable, all out of a sense of the righteousness of our own cause. The very focus on the local and particular makes it difficult to find a basis for criticizing corrupt practices. Now the second type. This will be a little bit longer. An analysis of a different kind of solidarity can be found in James Hunter's new book, I think a really important book, the sociologist from the University of Virginia, Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis. Although political theorists typically focus on consensus, Hunter thinks it's important that we distinguish between consensus and solidarity, and that we recognize the importance of the latter, what we might call ordinary, daily, civic solidarity. Consensus, Hunter suggests, is too high a standard for social comity. It's also explicitly rational and conscious in ways that solidarity need not be and usually is not. There are, he writes, many things besides our capacity to rationally argue and deliberate, things that are every bit as effective as they are cognitive. The power of solidarity is typically found in the unspoken, I'm still quoting, often vague or fuzzy resonances of shared affections, shared desires, shared challenges, shared hopes, and a shared destiny. These forms occur all around us in everyday life, reflected in mutual care, kindness, and generosity to friends, coworkers, and strangers. The effective bonds of solidarity in these places are not ubiquitous, but they are surely authentic, and to some extent, they still remain. I want to make 2 points very quickly about these forms of ordinary civic solidarity that Hunter's talking about. The first is that I think they are precisely the sort of customs that Aquinas would expect to be present in any reasonably healthy regime. The second is that while, according to Hunter, these forms of solidarity remain, many of the practices that succor them have been eroded. I think, for example, of the recent book by John Haidt, The Anxious Generation, where he talks about the loss of parental solidarity, the sense that you could let your kids roam free in the neighborhood and other parents and adults would sort of look out for them. Moreover, in themselves, these ordinary forms of solidarity are not sufficient for a flourishing life. Have, in the longer paper, have some stuff from Maurice Glassman's book, Blue Labor, The Politics of the Common Good, supporting and expanding on what Hunter's talking about. One response for Hunter to the forms of disintegration can be seen in the rise of identity groups. Here we have a different sort of solidarity from the one that we discussed above with the help of Sandel, who was articulating what might be thought of as conservative forms of solidarity. Identity group solidarity, by contrast, would seem most prevalent currently on the political left. I say seem because identity politics is a growth industry on the right as well. Hunter describes these forms of solidarity as compensatory. Here's a long quote. They represent an assertion of distinctiveness in a world that tends to flatten or level all meaningful differences. They represent the possibility for meaningful belief and purpose in a world that denies ultimate meaning and renders most beliefs a matter of mere taste. They further represent an anchor of certainty in a world of contingency, a way of belonging in a world that atomizes our existence, even as it weakens the ties of local and organic community. Not least, identity groups represent a heartfelt plea for recognition and the dignity it confers in a world that cares very little for the individual personally and cares for you publicly only insofar as you perform the role that you play. Finally, they represent the hope of a meaningful and significant life in a world where our lives are increasingly insignificant and inconsequential. The important sociological insight here for Hunter is that identity groups, whether progressive or conservative, are not primarily weapons in a culture war, although they are that. Instead, they are fundamentally responses to deeper undercurrents in what Hunter calls a shared nihilistic culture. Now, one of the dangers with such groups is that they are often fueled by ressentiment, by a focus on the other as an enemy with whom there is no possibility of mutual existence, much less reconciliation. These forms of solidarity often operate according to what Hunter calls cultural logics, forms of meaning-making rooted in premises that cannot themselves be authenticated or validated. For those who operate within their scripts, the world makes sense, as do the range of actions that follow from them, solely in terms of group solidarity. For what precisely are these novel forms of solidarity compensating? In the passage just cited, Hunter mentions loss of purpose and belonging and the absence of recognition and hope. He adds, absent a transcending telos, for none are available in the late modern age, and absent the moral logic for forgiveness, identity groups lack the capacity to imagine a future either for themselves or for others that overcomes the antecedent injury and disagreement. Now, connecting justice to the prospect of mercy or forgiveness does not, for Hunter or for me, entail that forgiveness should be offered as a way of quickly setting aside demands for justice, especially in a culture in which cheap grace of public confession has often been used as a means of ducking responsibility. Nor does allowing for the possibility of forgiveness solve in any peremptory way important questions about who has the authority to forgive whom for what in what circumstances. Still, without the prospect of forgiveness and reconciliation, we are left with nothing more than an unrelenting demand for strict justice, concerning which there are at least two problems. First, perfect justice for any serious offense is impossible. To restore what has been lost, we would have to be able to go back in time and make sure that the original harm never actually occurred. What is missing here is not only the possibility of forgiveness as a way of moving beyond without ever forgetting the injustice, but also a sense of the tragic limits to human justice. Second, an exclusive attention to strict justice deprives us of a powerful motivation for acknowledging one's failures, namely the prospect for forgiveness and reconciliation. Without these, we are left with a Manichaean vision, again shared on the left and the right, that divides the world up into the righteous and the damned. With Sandel and Hunter, we have two visions of solidarity. Sandel focuses on a more conservative version and Hunter on a more progressive type. But both see solidarity in terms of a kind of particularism. We might wonder whether there is not another type of solidarity on the left, a type that predates identity politics and is more focused on the universal, what I think Russ Hittinger calls in an article human rights solidarity. And it might be that one of the origins or causes of the growth of identity group solidarity is dissatisfaction with the attempt to ground solidarity in an abstract, universal, and impersonal account of human persons that seems to eliminate difference. Indeed, the universalist account is sometimes seen as demanding the effacement of particularity. It also fails to be compensatory, this universalist account, fails to be compensatory in the way, according to Hunter, identity groups are. It simply doesn't supply the sense of belonging and purpose and meaning. Of the two forms of solidarity with which we began, it is clear, I think, that the first form, that of unchosen obligations, is present in Aquinas, who affirms the existence of natural bonds antecedent to choice, in contrast to one of the dominant modern models of obligation, a contractual model. Thomas holds that we have obligations that we did not choose and that we can never fully repay. Aquinas' commitment to the obligation of solidarity of this sort is so strong that he repudiates the thesis that charity requires us to love everyone equally, in passages that are familiar to all of you. Still, Thomas's account of solidarity is never merely localist or only about unchosen obligations. And thus, he has, I think, the resources to respond to some of the common objections to this sort of solidarity. The movement beyond inherited natural bonds is evident not only in his account of the life of supernatural virtue, where charity urges us to care for strangers, even enemies. It's also evident on the natural level. Such a teaching is evident in the realm of natural obligation, where it has, I think, both negative and positive dimensions. On the basis of our universally shared human nature, the natural law forbids not only murder, but also the hatred of any other human being. The reason that such acts are wrong is that the human person has a nature that we ought to love. Hence, hating, let alone murdering, is contrary to the very nature of the human will. Not just prohibitions, but also positive obligations arise from our shared humanity. Consider Aquinas on the limitations to private property. God has established human beings as stewards of the goods of nature, acting with providential care not only for themselves but for others. To take what belongs to another is a sin of theft, but taking from another in cases of dire need is not theft. In these cases, Aquinas says, all things are common. Hence, whatever certain people have in superabundance is due by natural law to the purpose of succoring the poor. Here, Aquinas' account of justice extends not just to those to whom we have entered into a contract or to whom we owe what we have been given independently of and often prior to choice, but also to strangers in need. It thus shades over, I think, into his account of mercy. Aquinas locates misericordia under the infused virtue of charity, but he finds analogs in non-Christian sources, say Cicero, As a theological virtue with a natural basis, misericordia has an ambiguous status. Some elements of that virtue, being affected by the undeserved affliction of another and being willing to assist, would actually seem to be part of the virtue of justice. What mercy adds, among other things, is the making of the suffering of another my own suffering. Mercy is a species of sorrow wherein I make another person's sorrow my own, just as I would with a close friend. The overlap between justice and mercy can be spelled out a bit further, I think, by looking at the vices that Aquinas says undermine mercy. Vices such as pride and covetousness, which I think also undermine justice. The proud, he says, are without mercy because they despise others and think them wicked, so that they account them as suffering deservedly, whatever they suffer. Covetousness, one of the daughters of which is insensibility to mercy, erodes our capacity to respond to or even appropriately sympathize with others in need. The greatest risk of covetousness for Aquinas is that it breeds the illusion of self-sufficiency. Wealth denotes, Thomas says, the possession of things over which we have absolute mastery. In a seemingly counterintuitive argument, Aquinas holds that covetousness is primarily a spiritual rather than a carnal sin. It reaches its culmination not in physical pleasure, but in self-contemplative pleasure. The avaricious takes pleasure in the consideration of himself as the possessor of riches. The vices of pride and covetousness disable our capacity to see and respond with appropriate affection and discretion to those in need. The capacity to respond appropriately involves a host of virtues. It also involves a mediation between universal and particular. Suffering, disadvantage, neediness, injustice are evident not in the abstract, but in the specific and concrete conditions of action. Appropriate, that is to say, prudent and just responses, will be tailored to those particular circumstances. Being aware of both the nature that all human beings share in common and the peculiar situation of this particular neighbor enables us to avoid both identity politics and a purely abstract conception of justice. Now, I want to take up a certain objection to the view that particular identities are at all relevant. In response to the rise of identity politics, Christian critics stress unity and often appeal to the passage from Galatians, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, you are all one in Christ. This passage did indeed figure in a great speech that Martin Luther King gave to the National Council of Churches in 1957, entitled "For All, a Non-Segregated Society." Certainly the Christian faith is about unity. But the purely universalist view is not Catholic, nor for that matter is it the view of Martin Luther King or the mainstream civil rights movement. Catholic solidarity, I would argue, offers a vision of diversity or difference within unity. There are scriptural precedents. For instance, Pentecost, where the Tower of Babel curse is almost reversed, where everyone hears the apostles preaching in their own language. So there's a unity, but difference within the unity. God doesn't restore at Pentecost a unity of all languages. He allows for the diversity of languages. And also, similarly in Revelation, when the narrator sees a great multitude, of which no one could count, from every race, people, nation, and tongue. This is not a version of diversity absent unity, nor is it a vision of unity that annuls difference. John Paul II, by the way, there's a section in the longer paper, a reflection on Our Lady of Guadalupe as an example of a perfectly enculturated evangelization, I think is relevant here. Okay, what I'm calling the Catholic account of diversity within unity accords nicely with Aquinas' exposition of the virtues necessary to perform just and merciful acts. There is, moreover, I think, an opening in... I'm going to skip that and go straight to, since I'm almost out of time, go straight to the contemporary social science literature. What I wanted to say there was there's a connection between Aquinas on prudential judgment in the particular and what Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, calls proximity, and I think what Pope Francis calls encounter. But that's a big topic. So, finally, in an essay entitled What Makes Help Helpful, social scientist Oriol Quintana argues that organizations operating in a purely procedural manner have difficulty providing much-needed recognition and respect to the individuals whom they serve. He draws upon literature that argues that standardized procedures and respect for the individual are natural enemies. As he puts it, procedures act against recognition, are in fact designed to avoid recognition. Their sole purpose is smoothness and effectiveness. They are utilitarian. They serve the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Marie Falinger makes the same point with reference to projects that seeks to offer legal assistance to low-income clients. The ethics of solidarity demands that we do not totalize the other. It is built on mutuality, not identity. We are committed to each other not because of identical interests, but because of similar ones. We are fellow travelers, but not because we go all the way down the same road together. Rather, our lives intersect at crucial moments of encounter when we are bound to each other in the moment of action, whether we like it or not. This passage brilliantly navigates between two dangers. On the one hand, of a universalism that presumes sameness, on the other, a particularism that rules out the possibility of recognizing and acknowledging points of intersection and similarity. Two quick paragraphs. Quintana draws not just from social science, but also from the writings of George Orwell, to argue that the lack of solidarity arises from a reluctance to accept our own state of need, our own mortality. In the end, that explains all our difficulties with recognition. We might recall what Aquinas says about pride and covetousness as vices that produce the illusion of self-sufficiency and short-circuit justice and mercy. Solidarity entails a personal investment in the lives of others. It involves a willingness to carry costs. Here, the reflections of Romano Guardini, an Italian author who influenced both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, are quite helpful. He notes that an indispensable virtue for someone who offers kindness to another is that the giver should have reverence for the one who receives. Otherwise, the receiver might experience humiliation and become resentful. These virtues of kindness and gratitude that Guardini talks about are rooted in a personal encounter in human need, and they are essential to any ethics of solidarity. Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes for questions. I'll try to bring the microphone to you so you're heard over Zoom.
That was a race.
Thanks, Tom, for the paper. Hey. One of the functions of communities, you had a different word for them, but of groups who think alike, is information gathering, information processing in parallel, right? If you and I have read the same books, we're more or less on the same page. I can tell you about another book I read, and you buy it quickly, perhaps, right? That I didn't hear in the setup, right, of the description of communities. The more we push on the information gathering side, the more we start to build wisdom, craft, tradition, and head in a
Yes.
Mercantarian sort of direction.
Yeah.
I just wondered how that
Yeah.
line of thought might
So I
impact
didn't
your
talk
thought.
about in the longer paper, I do talk about the virtues of that first kind of solidarity, which does have to do, I don't talk explicitly about information sharing, but a shared deposit of wisdom and self-understanding that's shared. I think that's what makes those bonds and those obligations so fruitful, right, is that they allow for that. I also think in the longer paper, I kind of come back to the objection that those bonds sort of inherently or almost naturally, implicitly generate problems with responding to those who are not in the in-group. And I think so you can take something like Lord of the Rings, which is certainly focused on those kinds of bonds, but the hobbits are pulled out of the Shire, right? They're pulled into a bigger world. I think also there's a great passage in toward the end of McIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals, where he says every group has got to come up with rules, not just for governing internal relations, but for how they're going to respond to the stranger, to the outsider, right? And it seems to me in the articulation of those accounts, you see in many of these very tradition-heavy accounts, say Homer, right? This obligation to host the stranger when that stranger comes upon you. That's the one thing the gods never go back on in Homer, is the guest host obligation. And that's outside of any reciprocity. It's outside of any thought that these people will help me in the future or that they're necessarily part of my internal group. So I think in a lot of these societies that are actually pretty traditional and focused on unchosen obligations, there are also deep obligations to strangers. So I think that initial critique, which I come back to at the end of the longer paper, is pretty superficial if you start to drill down into those societies.
Thank you, Professor Hibbs, for a fascinating talk. You mentioned that standardized procedures can basically crowd out the capacity of an organization, say, to recognize and really promote the uniqueness of individuals. I was a bit puzzled about that, so this is really an invitation to clarify and maybe amplify
and I was
that
quoting
idea.
from the Quintana. Go ahead.
And that was a quotation. So I was just wondering, so you might think that organizations introduce standardized procedures precisely to streamline organizational workflow in a way that allows for kind of deep pockets of discretion that lets people deploy their unique gifts and talents to then have really a say in the outcome in a way that kind of expresses their unique personhood. And you didn't say a whole lot about that, so I'm just curious to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to be in any complex organization that didn't have streamlined, publicly stated procedures. Right? You're inviting chaos and all sorts of vices to come in and camp amid that chaos. I think what they're in the social science literature, and again, I go into this more in the longer paper, but I think what they're concerned with is the way in which a reduction to routinized care eliminates the personal. So it's simply a matter of delivering the service and checking the box. This is bureaucracy at its worst, right? So it would be proceduralism understood as impersonal bureaucracy, where the only thing that matters is following the rules, right? And delivering whatever needs to be delivered, whether they're impactful or not. This is a problem with an awful lot of what we're doing in the areas of fighting human trafficking, to fighting poverty, to police reform, where we're using bureaucratic, abstract procedures that are not actually anchored in individuals, in the personal care of individuals, in the kind of proximity that Stevenson talks about. They're also not effective because they're simply concerned with, the goal is not actually to help people. The goal is actually just to follow the rule of the bureaucracy. That's what they're concerned with. But I take your point.
Hi. Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I was wondering how you spoke a little bit about the obligation to host guests. Can you speak a little bit more about Aquinas' perception for Catholic social teaching for the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, and how that might fit in like a practical sense for our obligations towards each other?
So I've got 2 minutes.
You got 4. We got 4. You're good.
We got 4?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, I can give another paper then. There's actually a really good talk by Russ Hittinger that he gave in Chicago on solidarity and the preferential option for the poor, where he goes through what he takes to be the 4 senses of solidarity in Catholic social teaching and talks about how all of them are applicable in what he takes to be a legitimate preferential option for the poor. So instead of me trying to mimic in a really bad way, even if I had a lot of time, I couldn't do it justice the way Russ does. So I would suggest, and if you want a particular reference after, I'd be happy to give that to you.
One more quick question? All right, then we'll move on.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks a lot.
Randall Smith is the author of over 30 scholarly articles and 6 books, the latest of which, on Bonaventure's Journey of the Mind unto God, is due out from Cambridge University Press in October. His articles appear every other week on The Catholic Thing and have been translated into French, Spanish, Czech, and Portuguese. He has published articles in Catholic World Report, The Front Porch Republic, Public Discourse, and National Review, and can be heard interviewed regularly on LA Catholic Radio. Professor Smith will speak today on Thomas Aquinas on natural right, natural justice, and natural law.
Yeah, just to make clear, LA Catholic Radio is Louisiana. I mean, it is. When they first attacked me, I was like, wow, LA Catholic, and Mobile, Alabama, anyway. Early in Plato's Republic, Socrates asks young Polemarchus, what is it that you affirm, Simonides says, and says rightly, about justice, dikaiosunes? To which the younger man replies, it is just, dikaion, to render to each his due. The Greek word there is something that's related to owed or debt. Now, Simonides lived 556 to 468 BC, and the Republic takes place roughly 410 BC. So for perhaps as much as a century, to render each his due had been a common understanding of justice. Now, this was good for a start, but as we know, Socrates had a few more questions, and so the conversation went on for 10 more books. And in the centuries that followed, we get, as Alfred North Whitehead once said, a long series of footnotes to Plato. So, for example, in Aristotle's Rhetoric, he defines justice, dikaiosune, as the virtue which assigns to each man his due. Saint Isidore of Seville, in his influential Etymology, states that a man is said to be just, justus, now the Latin, because he respects the right, the use of others, use ius. And centuries after Plato, we still find in the first words of Justinian's famous law code, justice is a constant and perpetual will to render each one his due, use, ius. This last definition is the one Aquinas adopts in the Summa Theology, where he defines justice as, quote, a habit, habitus, whereby a man renders to each one his due, use, with a constant and perpetual will. Now, one of the sticking points in modern interpretations of Aquinas is how to understand that little word use that Aquinas calls the object of justice, justitia, right? Justitia. Some of the confusion has arisen because translators often translate jus naturalis and lex naturalis as natural law, causing people to assume that jus is a law. It isn't. So in what follows, I will try to clarify what Aquinas means by use and show how a proper understanding of it illuminates our understanding of jus naturalis, lex naturalis, and justitia naturalis. But we must begin with that little word, use. The first confusion we must avoid is not to mistake Aquinas' use with our modern notion of an absolute right. The Latin word use was translated into the Anglo-Saxon recht, which implies aligned or fitting, a proper measure. This communicates something of the nature of use, since as Aquinas says, the matter of justitia, quote, is external operation insofar as an operation of the thing used in that operation is duly proportionate to another person. Wherefore the mean of justice consists in a certain proportion of equality between the external thing and the external person. In the modern world, however, a right is taken to be a universal, inalienable, subjective right, something due to everyone regardless of the circumstances. Something this modern use of the word right often blinds us to is that a right is always an obligation on someone else. Modern folk have little trouble believing they have rights that should be respected. They have more difficulty accepting that they have obligations they have not chosen. If I have a right to health care, then someone must supply me with health care. Who is obligated to do that? Only people who have chosen to be obligated? And if no one chooses, well, the right is empty. Perhaps this is why some authors have claimed these subjective rights do not exist. Jeremy Bentham described rights as nonsense upon stilts, and Alistair MacIntyre said that belief in rights is one with belief in witches and unicorns. On Thomas's account, we do have obligations to others, and they to us. But these obligations are not always universal and absolute with the modern notion of rights. Nor is right use in Aquinas a universalizable principle of rightness, such as generated by Kant's categorical imperative. A right use can be limited, and often is, depending on the people, the circumstances, and the relationship involved, considered within the context of concern for the common good. In his magisterial work on justice, Joseph Pieper says that, quote, "We cannot state the basis of a right, and hence of a judicial obligation, unless we have a concept of man, of human nature. Right use on this view, and the obligations we have towards others in justice, are bound up with their nature and ends as we discover them through experience and reason. Because we are fallen beings, God has also revealed some of the most fundamental obligations we have to others in the moral precepts of the old law." Return to that later. And yet we must distinguish. A debitus, or use, can arise in two ways, says Aquinas. On the one hand, a thing might be due to a person based on agreements, treaties, promises, or legal decisions. I contract with my plumber to fix my sink. She does, and I pay her the $200 we agreed upon. That was maybe a few years ago. This is contractual use. If, however, a contract involved conditions contrary to the dignity of the worker, unsafe working conditions, inadequate wage, then this would violate natural use. In classical and medieval usage, we find use applied to many contractual relationships. Land contracts, for example, where one person may have had the jus utendi, the right to use property without destroying its substance, while another person had a jus fruendi, the right to reap some fruits or profits of the property. There were many such jura rights in the ancient and medieval world, specifying what was due and what obligations were expected. In addition to these contractual rights, however, there are things due to others based on the nature of the thing, ex ipsa natura rei. This, says Thomas, is called natural right, jus naturale. What creates a natural right as opposed to a contractual right is that things have the intrinsic value they have, the value we're called upon to respect, because they have been created by God and given specific natures in accord with which they flourish. Hence, to know what is required by right, use, in justice, justitia, we must first understand something about the nature of the thing or the person with which we are dealing, and then we must understand our relation to that person within the context of the common good. On Aquinas' account, what distinguishes humans from other creatures is that we can come to know, understand, and respect the natures and ends of other beings. We go wrong when we fail to understand the nature of things and try to use them in ways contrary to their proper ends. Becoming a mature adult, then, entails understanding the natures and ends of the things in the world and taking proper account of these in deciding my purposes. Instead of simply trying to manipulate things in accord with my purposes should respect the nature and ends of the things I encounter. My dog is not a horse, so my purposes should be in accord with the dog's nature and end. I should not try to ride him like a horse or make him pull a plow like an ox. So too, a fortiori, my fellow humans have a distinctive nature and end that I should respect. If my purpose is to build a pyramid in Egypt or a tower in modern New York, I should, well, that was very nice. Anyway, I should not treat the workers as if they were oxen, mules, or machines. I should respect the natural limitations of their bodies and respect their natures as both rational and free, and of a certain strength, character, need for food, etc., etc. Now, when a woman in the rural South says of a man who has impregnated her, he needs to do right by me, she is expressing something of the classical sense of right. She does not mean I have a universal inalienable right that makes a claim on every person, which she might mean were she proposing that every pregnant woman in the country has a right to be supported by the state. Rather, in the language of the South, she means that because this man has impregnated her, because he is the father of the child, he now has a duty to help support that child. Being a father means one has the duties of a father. Why would she claim this, and why would society agree that he has this duty? On the Thomistic account, it would be because he is the father of this child, and human children, unlike the young of many other species, needs a long period of nurture and education within the context of a stable marriage between both parents. Would belief in a personal creator God be necessary to accept the notion that there are natural rights, jura? Not necessarily. One simply might have concluded from observation that doing certain things or refraining from doing certain things is conducive to or destructive of human flourishing. much as we conclude from observation that plants need water and sun, but children need water, sun, and a balanced diet and exercise. Christians believe that divine revelation helps to reinforce something we know, at least in part by human reason. The more we discover, either by reason or revelation about created things, the better respect we can show them, provided we are of a mind to respect them, rather than use our knowledge merely to manipulate them, as though we were their God. This temptation to reconstitute and control the world according to our own will, like a god, is the fundamental temptation of the serpent in the garden. We observe the right in our relationships with others, on the contrary, when we conform our will and actions to reality, as it has been created and revealed by God, and to the fundamental obligations that should govern us, revealed especially in the Ten Commandments. Right use, says Thomas, quote, depends on commensuration with another person. But we can distinguish two basic senses of another. Someone may be simply other, as when two people are not subject to one another, but both are subjects of the same state. Or someone may be said to be other, not simply, simpliciter, but, quote, as belonging in some way to that something else. For example, a son who has received his existence from his father is other than his father, but also in a certain way part of him, or part of the family. Thus, there will be a difference between the sort of right appropriate to the relations between a father and son, and the sort of right appropriate to the relations between the citizens in a state. Or as I say to my students, you owe certain things to me. You owe certain things to your mother. They're not the same things, right? You owe more to your mother, but you don't owe your mother a written assignment every week. Within the civil sphere, there are also distinctions to be made between the right, use proper to, for example, the military, which is the jus militare, magistrates, jus magistratum, or priests, the jus sacerdotum. These are still natural rights, but they are associated with various offices necessary to the state. Note, however, that all forms of justice, whatever use is involved, whether military, governmental, or ecclesiastical, are to be erected ultimately to the common good. The good of any virtue, says Thomas, whether such virtue direct man in relation to himself or in relation to other individual persons, is referable to the common good to which justice directs, so that all acts of virtue can pertain to justice insofar as it directs man to the common good. When the subject is justice, people tend to think of either commutative or legal justice. But there is also commutative one-on-one, me, my plumber. But there is also distributive justice. And in Aquinas' discussion of distributive justice, it is even clearer that use often depends on social position or rank. In distributive justice, says Aquinas, quote, a person receives all the more of the common goods according as he holds a more prominent position in the community. Hence, in distributive justice, the mean is observed not according to equality between thing and thing, but according to a proportion between things and persons, in such a way that even as one person surpasses another, so that which is given to one person surpasses that which is allotted to another. Poor people, for example, often need more help than those whose wealth allows them to weather the storm more easily. Government officials often need more security than citizens, both because of the increased danger to their lives and because of the important office they have within the community. Aquinas often speaks of how such rights are associated with a role or position within society. It is not proper, he writes, for a judge to pass judgment on a man not subject to his jurisdiction or on a man not accused. Nor can a judge licitly remit the punishment on a person convicted of a crime because, says Thomas, there is on the part of the accuser a right, use, that the guilty party should be punished. And it is not in the power of a judge to remit such punishment, since every judge is bound to give each man his right, use. As for the accused, although he is in duty bound to tell the judge the truth, the judge is bound in judicial proceedings but by what is often translated as the form of law, but which in Latin is secunda formam iuris. Thus, if the judge asks the accused what he should not ask, in accordance with the order of right, secundum ordinam iuris, the accused is not bound to answer, although he still may not lie. So too, a king has a right to have his authority respected, But a free citizen has a right of speaking against a ruler, jus contradicendi, if the ruler passes an unjust law. Priests have a right, jus, to receive tithes, the jus accipiendi decimas. This debt, debitum, is owed, debentur, to ministers of the altar for the expenses of their ministry, and hence this right, says Thomas, is applicable to them alone. Note, in all these cases, the relationship between privileges and obligations follows upon a certain role, relationship, or office. Now, to be clear, there are certain things we owe to others that are universal, in accord with the nature of the thing, namely human beings. So, for example, we owe others not to murder them, nor steal from them, nor lie to them, or commit adultery. There are complexities that might cause us to take a life if we are a soldier in a just war, or to take something that does not belong to us if we are starving and have no other source of food. But we must never commit adultery, never murder, never steal, and never lie. These are exceptionless obligations we owe to all human persons, because they are human. What then is the natural law? The precepts of the natural law are, on Thomas's account, basic expressions of natural justice, which is in one sense prior. Law, says Augustine, in question 57, article 1 of the Secunda Secundae, is an expression of right. I'll say that again. Law is a certain expression of right, rather than law determining what is just. But these general principles, as important as they are only starting points. They are a sine qua non for a moral community, like don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. But it is no more possible to derive all moral judgments demonstratively from these basic principles than it would be possible to derive all practical judgments about any skill, whether sailing, chess, or playing a violin sonata, from the general principles one finds in even the best textbooks. Understanding Thomas's notion of use, let me finish up here, it can help us avoid certain common mistakes. We should not, for example, mistake what Thomas means by respect for a right within the context of concern for the common good with the social contractarian notion of a right, usually based on the preservation of life and property, or with the post-Enlightenment notion of a universal subjective right which trumps social benefits or social utility and must be respected apart from all but the most egregious threats to the common good. So too, we should not be tempted to think of justice and right only in terms of commutative justice in relation between individuals, forgetting distributive justice and general justice, both of which require greater appreciation of the common good. Nor should we make the natural law into a moral calculus, like the universal principles of Kant's categorical imperative, so that prudence would be simply applying the general principles of law to specific circumstances. Whereas on Thomas's account, prudence, on the authentic Thomistic view, is something more like a skill, requiring not only a firm understanding of the fundamental principles, but also memory, docility, which is teachableness, shrewdness, reason, foresight, circumspection, and caution. It is a much more finely honed instrument that takes into account social roles, social circumstances, past experiences, and possible future outcomes. We must also not imagine we can discuss the moral guidance, prudence, and the virtues apart from the fundamental exceptionalist norms of the Ten Commandments and the foundational precepts to love God and neighbor, which we have received by revelation. And for Thomas, the selfless love which we are supposed to fulfill the commandments and which are supposed to animate the virtues is made available by Christ's sacrifice on the cross. It is not something of which we are capable on our own, especially in our fallen state with our corrupted natures. So God must give us that love as a gift of his grace, an unmerited gift, but one which we must act on. Thomas associates this grace with what he calls the new law, the law of love, the law instilled in us by God's own Holy Spirit, distinguishing it as the second part of the divine law, along with the old law, or Mosaic law. So the natural law, the old law and justice, all must be animated by the new law, the law of grace, by which the Holy Spirit spreads charity abroad in our hearts. For Thomas, when justice is guided by a prudence that understands human nature and human flourishing, and animated by a love that wills the good for others, and does not satisfy itself with merely obeying lifeless rules, then the psalmist's promise of the kingdom of God is fulfilled, that, quote, love and truth will meet, and justice and peace will kiss. Thank you very much.
start with Dan.
Well, thank you, Randy, for an excellent presentation. I want to ask your question about your view of universal absolute rights. So when you began your talk, you referred to these as a kind of modern idea and referred to them as they were kind of a corruption of the more sounder medieval view of rights.
Yeah, I just said it was different.
Oh, okay.
No,
Well,
I get that you talk. I mean, I don't mean to suggest, you know, it is. I think McIntyre's probably right on this. It is a modern notion, but then there's a debate, as you know, between Tierney and Finnis and others about its source in medieval life. And my paper, I think, would go in both directions. In other words, I have nothing to say about that debate right at the moment.
Well,
right?
my question was more that more about the status of of universal human
Yeah.
rights in the world today. So in
Gotcha.
the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have universal human rights spelled out. And then in the Magisterium, starting with John the 23rd on through John Paul II, there's an endorsement of human rights, but with a claim that they're rooted in natural law.
Right.
Now, towards the end of your talk, you endorsed natural law. You said there were universal obligations not to murder, steal, and so forth, and lie, and true for every person and so forth. But are there universal human rights? Are there natural human rights that are true for everyone everywhere that go with the obligations? So if I have an obligation not to murder, someone else has a right not to be murdered and so forth.
Yeah, it sort of works the opposite way. In other words, if I have a right, then someone else has, it's obligation on someone else, right? And the difficulty, as Thomas understands, I'm sure you know, is that the reason why almost all the precepts of the Decalogue and exceptions, moral norms are in negative form is because it's easier and clearer to say what you cannot do in any circumstance. It's harder to say what you must do in every and all circumstances, right? Other than, honor your parents, even there. Anyway, but so the difficulty so I'm not opposed to, it would be a longer discussion about how I think rights should operate. I think there is room. I'm a Catholic. I understand the church has embraced this. I will only say maybe two things about this. One is that I teach Catholic social justice, and last year I decided to use the compendium of Catholic social justice, which is good in many ways and does many things. But as I was working my way through it with the students, I kind of realized that their use of the language of rights tangled them up in all sorts of problems that you just can't get out of if you use the language of rights. So, for example, the positive right. Again, if I say there's a right to immigration, or I say there's a right to health care, let's just take the right to health care. Well, then the point is, who's supposed to, provide that? And if you don't have a good answer to that, and the church doesn't, well, then it's empty. And again, you just get yourself tangled up into all sorts of, of subjective rights. And everybody sees us on every college campus, right? All the students have these rights. They have no obligations, right? And so I have a right to play my stereo at 90 decibels at 2 in the morning, but I have a right to sleep, and I have a right to, it's like, look, and we have and so people have written about this, the difficulty of rights language. I'm not opposed to rights. I accept them with the church, but I think it requires more work. I would prefer if we went back to, we'd probably be safer if we went back to the language of justice, right? And use in various and sundry ways, okay? We would just probably a lot easier. But I haven't worked all that out anyway.
Thanks for a terrific paper, Randy. My question's a lawyer's question. You referred to the judge having a responsibility to render right, but not necessarily to render something beyond that right.
Right.
And my mind immediately went to the distinction we draw in common law jurisdictions between the jurisdiction of a common law judge and a court exercising equitable jurisdiction, where equitable jurisdiction will, since the 17th century, I think, or so, trump the common law jurisdiction, but you'd have to go to the right court to get the right answer.
Right.
Now, over time, and different common law jurisdictions have handled this differently, there's been a tendency to fuse those two jurisdictions into one judge. But it's striking because the example is that, for example, you might have at common law some strict rights under a contract, which someone really owes because you've promised and so forth. But then under equity, you might have exercised undue influence over a poor old lady and therefore a court of equity will intervene and say that you can't demand those rights. Does your thesis have any implications for how jurisdiction should be structured? Or is it, in one sense, indifferent to that, so long as you have a system whereby you can secure the equitable jurisdiction when it's needed? Or does it actually drive towards the notion, because you use the concept of use so generally, that one court and one judge should have all of that jurisdiction to do justice in the case?
Yeah, my view, I mean, again, the notion of use I'm talking about would be any kind of justice, right? I mean, this is a very high level of generality in terms of that. So personal, commutative, anything, right? Distributive. I suppose the quick answer to that, if I can give a quick answer to that, because it needs a bigger thing, would be something with regard to the principle of the common good, right? In other words, you'd have to, as a politician or as people setting up a court system, say to yourself very clearly, how is this operating, right? In other words, if you found people who had a need which was simply not being answered by the courts as you've structured them, or, right, like, in other words, people are going with equity and are like, well, we don't really judge that, that doesn't really come. I mean, we see this in bureaucratic, situations all the time. You call up your insurance agency, we don't deal with that. That's not our thing. And you're like, well, where am I? Anyway, and so this becomes a huge problem in society, right? And so I think you'd really have to say to yourself, something along those lines, right? Like, are we serving the needs that have arisen, in contemporary society that might have been a court system that worked in the 16th, 17th century, and it might still work, but I'm not saying just change, but I mean, I suppose that would be the answer to that. A kind of, I don't want to say a distributive justice, but I just would say a common good issue. And then you're going to get Brad Lewis to tell you what that is.
So it seems like you're tying, and if I say anything you disagree with, just interrupt me. But
okay, that's wrong.
But it seems...
Yeah, it's a very dangerous thing to say. But go ahead. No.
It seems like you're tying the idea of an obligation of justice to this notion of right conformity, which implies a kind of judgment on the person who has the obligation of kind of judging their own role in relation to some other person or thing.
Yes, let me say yes to that so far.
Okay, great. So would that then imply that obligation then would, there would be no kind of, there'd be no obligation that doesn't imply some sort of perspective that you're making the judgment from? I mean, you always have to be relating yourself, whereas you wouldn't find yourself in a situation where you go, that thing I see out in the world seems wrong, but it's not wrong in relation to me. Like, I'm not in non-conformity with anything, therefore there's no obligation on my part. So like when people talk about oh, there's this injustice that exists, the argument would therefore be there's an implicit obligation, like you are not in conformity to this injustice out in the world in some way because of some kind of universal human obligation or something like that? Or would there be an argument of well, you can just see that something is wrong, even though you're not doing anything wrong in relation to it, and feel some kind of duty to intervene?
Yeah, we have this question all the time, it seems to me, right? Namely, we see things that we think are unjust, or we see our friends doing something wrong, and we say, well, I think that's wrong. Parents might be raising their children in ways with which you disagree, and you think, well, that's too much. And you say, but I'm not in the position. A certain prudence says, I'm not in the position to be the one to correct them on this, right? And we make these judgments repeatedly throughout the day, right? And that will have something to do with the culture, something to do with again, in an earlier talk, somebody was talking about how the collective parental responsibility is something that people used to have. So people could feel like their kids could go out because other parents would kind of look after them in certain ways, and could even, say, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. Whereas that doesn't happen anymore. So in some sense, it's prudence has something to do with, and I think this is true all around. I mean, look, there is going to be a different kind of attitude and behavior of a fundamental sort, right? Not like, again, I shouldn't kill you, I shouldn't kill, somebody's grandmother. But when I go in to visit people in the assisted living facility that my mother-in-law is in, I have to treat them differently than I treat you. I talk to them differently. I do not talk to my mother-in-law this way. I do not say, now, Joan, sit down, you don't know what, I don't tell my students that way either, quite frankly. But anyway, there might be circumstances and I think we make these judgments all the time, and maturity, moral maturity, is precisely understanding us relationally. But again, with certain universals, which I've, I'm open to, and I haven't mentioned all of them, et cetera, but there are certain universal principles. I'm not denying that. It's just that jus naturale is not all those things.
We'll hold further questions for the final discussion. Bradley Lewis is Dean and Associate Professor in the School of Philosophy of the Catholic University of America. He specializes in political and legal philosophy and is presently completing a book manuscript provisionally titled The Common Good and the Modern State. Brad Lewis's talk today will be on Aquinas' practical common good.
Okay, thank you. So the paper that I've written, which I'm not going to read, I'm going to talk through the main points of it, but the paper itself is drawn from the manuscript of this still potential book that John has, but it's closer to actuality than it's ever been before, which is called The Common Good and the Modern State. And that project of that book concerns, I would say, two issues of substance and one sort of issue of method related to its subject. And the first question is that there are all these, and we know about them all just from reading and listening to lectures at conferences like this and so forth, contemporary concerns about the problems of liberal politics, the thinness and moral lightness in many cases of liberal politics, and the help that could come to them from pre-modern notions, especially notions like that of the common good, especially people worried about individual rights and so forth. Obviously, the thing to go to would be something like obligations, but also obligations that have to do with the common good. And especially the idea that the biggest help to contemporary liberal political institutions would be to infuse their politics with a kind of metaphysical substance, in particular, that they don't have. So that's one set of concerns. Another one specifically has to do with modern Catholic social teaching and the way that modern Catholic social teaching has talked about the common good in the canonical documents since the pontificate of at least, I think, Pius XII, but that come to their kind of culmination, you might say, in the documents of the Second Vatican Council, especially Gaudium et Spes, Articles 26 and 74. That's the, I think now, kind of ubiquitous notion that the common good is the sum total of conditions according to which persons and groups can more fully and easily achieve their perfection. And there are scholars who have thought that that formulation was problematic precisely because it was somehow a deviation from the tradition, especially from the views of St. Thomas. So that's a kind of second substantive question that I'm concerned with. And then the issue of method is simply about how ideas that are developed in one very particular historical context, historical and political context, change when they're carried over into much later and even contemporary times and used in very different contexts. So the notion of the common good, just as an idea, I mean, sort of a phrase that would literally be translated into common good in English. The first instance of that I can find in Western thought is actually in the 7th century BC, in the Athenian/Spartan elegiac poet Tertius. Although it's in the Doric dialect, but it would be translated in that way, but it's much more famous when it gets used by
Aristotle, and then it's carried into modernity largely on the back of Catholic social teaching, beginning in the Neo-Thomistic revival and through there. But certainly there are changes of context there that make it difficult to kind of read the notion in exactly the same way. So those are kind of the big concerns that drive what I'm doing here. And there's a particular issue for Aquinas then. Yves Simon wrote at one point that political philosophy was the least developed philosophical area in Aquinas' thought. And I think he was right about that. There are subsequent developments of political things that have been carried out by Thomas, especially in the 20th century, Simon himself, but also Jacques Maritain. But they're sort of exceptions. I think it's still the case that Thomistic political philosophy is undeveloped, and where you really see this is sort of in the kind of rump of political theory that exists within the field of political science now. There's awfully little Thomism to be found in those precincts. You find it in philosophy departments more, but I think in general that's rather true. Now, more recent concerns that aim to find a solution to the problems of liberal politics and so forth, as I said, often turn to Thomas's notion of the bonum commune, of the common good. And there's a famous problem here, which is that Thomas says very little about that in a kind of definitory way, right? There's, as far as I know, there's sort of one article that's simply and only devoted to the topic of the common good in the Summa. It's mentioned in many other places, sort of en passant, it's as if everybody understands what it means. But it's not like there's a quaestio on the common good. I mean, I think there should be a whole disputed question, with lots of articles and so forth. But he didn't do that. And so in the contemporary discussions, when people want to turn to Thomas, what they frequently do is turn to other people who've developed that notion, and especially the great Belgian-Canadian philosopher Charles de Connick, and his specific ideas about how his notion of the common good should be understood as something that's numerically one but extends to many effects. And I could say a lot more about the specifics of that, but I think a lot of people are familiar more now than used to be, for sure. The internet has educated us all on this topic. There is a question about that, though, and the question is, how much does this way of talking about the common good really help? Matthew Kempschall, in his really important book on the common good in late medieval political thought, has pointed out that you can sort of find two different types of texts where Thomas talks about the common good. There's a set of texts that are very much in the vein of sort of speculative natural theology, and then there's another set of texts that really are very practical, and they talk about specific moral issues or specific social problems. But it's never completely clear how those two groups relate to one another. So how you relate the sort of ideas that come from the natural theology, even cosmological discussions, to the very practical discussions. So you think about a text like Prima Secundae, or Secunda Secundae 64:2, for example, which is about killing. And it turns out that there is intentional killing that's justified in certain circumstances when it's necessary to protect the bonum commune, when it's necessary to protect the common good. It's not clear what the connection between that practical judgment is and something about the common good as one thing, numerically one, extending to many effects and so forth, and how those link up with one another. So exactly how this adds to or solves the practical problems that we have, it seems to me, is an issue that's not fully satisfactorily worked out by anyone. So I want to, for purposes of just this paper, leave aside the sort of texts that are really the natural, theological, speculative texts and concentrate on a set of texts that are far more practical, and so that I think have a little more possibility for at least finding some practical explanations. And I'm going to leave aside one issue that's even related to those things that's, I know, of interest to many people, but there just simply isn't time to cover it, and that's specifically the issue that's to do with church and state, temporal and spiritual and so on. I'm not going to talk about that. I have some stuff in my manuscript about it, but I'm not going to talk about it today. So Thomas was not primarily a political thinker. He was not primarily a political theorist. Political things occur in his writings in a kind of practical, en passant way. They come up. But we do have two very practical texts that have to do with politics that he wrote. Both of them are vexed in certain ways. And I have in mind the Contra Impugnantes on the one hand and the De Regno on the other hand. The Contra Impugnantes, which was probably written around 1256, right, is a text that emerged from the controversy between spiritual and secular professors at the University of Paris in the 1250s. And specifically, it's a response to a work by a theologian named William of Saint-Amour, who attacked the religious professors there on the view that it's simply inconsistent for them to be contemplatives and also to be teaching at the same time. So he thought they should stick to the contemplation and not be involved in teaching in universities. That was something for secular priests. And so Thomas responded to that in this essay. Now you might say, well, is that really a political dispute? Is there really anything political in that controversy? And I think in an extended sense, the answer is yes. There were issues about overlapping jurisdictions, which was a big issue in the Middle Ages, which is politically an extremely sloppy time in human history with all kinds of different communities that are, overlapping and intersecting with one another, and problems that emerged from that. And different kinds of associations, and in fact the way this is discussed is sometimes in terms of talking about different forms of human associations other than political communities, but that are often related to them. Institutions, the bishops were involved, the Pope was involved. In the end, the King of France actually got involved in the whole thing and brought coercive force to bear on the outcome of the controversy. So there is a political dimension to it that I think is important. The second work that I am concerned with is the De Regno, which was written between 1265 and 1268 probably. The big problem with that, everybody knows, it's unfinished, so it's a fragment. It's not actually true who it's addressed to. There's several candidates, but it's not clear which king of Cyprus is the one that it's about. There also are issues of doctrine in the De Regno. He seems to say, or at least some people think he says different things about tyrannicide there than he says in other works. He says different things about the relationship between spiritual and temporal power than he says in other works. So there's these kinds of questions. William McCormick has written a whole book on the De Regno, which discusses a lot of these things. The bottom line being that one should use the De Regno with caution. This was Chénou's view, and Father Dondane, who wrote the introduction to the Leonine text, affirms that and says it's a useful work, it's authentic, pretty sure it's authentic, but it has to be used with caution, and always in connection with later, more developed texts by Aquinas. So first, a little bit about the Contra Impugnantes. The basic principle that's stated there as a kind of main principle to resolve the difficulty is a principle that Thomas states in many other places, that one should prefer the common good to the private good. And that's the issue that he appeals to decide the debate between the secular priests and the religious priests in that particular context. Now, for my argument, I think what's really interesting about the discussion of the common good in the De Regno is that he uses two different terms there. If you just kind of look at an English translation, often it just says common good or something like that. But sometimes it says bonum commune, sometimes it says utilitas communis. And so far as I can tell, those usages are interchangeable with one another. I don't see that there's really anything different that they mean. Now, people sometimes are exercised by that because they think, well, okay, bonum is one thing, utilitas is another thing. I'm not convinced that that is actually the case in medieval Latin or classical Latin. I think we see utilitas and we think utility and we think about Jeremy Bentham and so forth. But I think in classical and medieval Latin, the semantic range of the term utilitas is rather different than it is for us. And I think it's often kind of interchangeable with bonum. I mean, even the text of the Mass, right? Lord, accept the sacrifice at my hands for the good, our good, and the good of all his holy church, right? The word that's translated as good in the liturgy is utilitas in that case. So now that the pair of terms is used interchangeably in Quodlibet 7, which was written about the same time and concerned some of the same issues, and also in Summa Contra Gentiles 3:135. And again, in every case, it seems to me that it's used interchangeably there. Much of the argument in the Contra Impugnantes is drawn from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but it concerns different kinds of communities. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is almost always talking about the polis, about the city. And Thomas is talking about other kinds of communities, cities, universities, kingdoms, a variety of different human communities. But it's crucial that some of these are societies, what we would call civil society groups. Russ Hittinger has written very well on this. He thinks that the Contra Impugnantes is sort of the first treatise on the notion of civil society. And he analogizes those to what's translated there as the Republica. And again, the Aristotelian principle is that in a city, the final cause of political authority and of any kind of governmental authority is the common good. And so that's why it plays the role in the contrapugnantes that it does. But I think in a rather non-technical way. Again, the fact that those two expressions are interchangeable doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to whether he uses one or the other. And I think you can find this even more so in a more obviously political work, the De Regno. And there, in fact, the terminology is even more various. So when he's talking about the final, and that's a big issue in the De Regno, he's talking about a king. What's a king for? He's for ruling. You have to know what the final cause of that rule is. Final cause is, in some sense, the good of the political community. How is that described? Well, it's described as the bonum commune, by my count, 15 times in the part of the De Regno that was actually, we're pretty certain, written by Thomas. 3 times he refers to it as the bonum publicum. 1 time he refers to communi perfectui, and 9 times bonum multitudinis. So there's actually 4 different expressions that are used, again, as far as I can tell, interchangeably. I don't think there's any really rule as to which one he uses in any particular circumstance. And that suggests to me that, to sort of try to resolve the issue by saying, technically speaking, what does he mean by bonum? Well, it's either bonum delectabile, bonum utile, or it's bonum honestum. What does he mean by communis? Well, there's common by causally, there's common by predication, and you sort of figure it out that it doesn't look like that would work here, given that he uses all these different terms. At the center of the argument in the De Regno is really the basic notion that the leader of a people and the rule that's exercised by that leader cannot simply be for his own benefit and that of his friends, but has to be for the benefit of everyone. It's a very simple point. Again, it's not very technical. And in making this point, right, the references are always bonum commune, bonum multitudinis, in some cases even runs those two together, bonum commune multitudinis. The basic elements of that end, whatever he calls it, in any particular circumstances, he says more than once in the De Regno, are mainly 2 things. Salus, so the welfare or health of the community, but health not in a physical way, but more extensively than that, and peace, pax, which includes in particular unity. That peace includes the unity of the political community. Most of the references, when he's talking about these things, are to Aristotle and the commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics. And it's interesting there that the term pax in specific passages that Aquinas quotes, and so he's quoting Grosseteste's translation of the Nicomachean Ethics. If you go to Aristotle's text, the word that's being translated as peace is eunomia, which in Greek means something like well-governed or lawful. And it looks like the meaning of that term in Greek political thought really is it doesn't have to do so much with the quality of the laws in the city, but with the people actually following the laws in the city, so that it's a city that is lawful. And that's the term that's being translated as peace. So it doesn't simply mean the absence of conflict. It means more than that. It's a more capacious term that has to do with the overall quality of communal life. Now, there is a distinction, important, I think, in the De Regno between the job of the king, which is focused on salus and pax, and the end of the community. I mean, clearly the end of the community, the thing that the community is ultimately for Thomas, is the total kind of even morally well-living of the whole community. Vivere secundum virtutum is the term that he uses. And if you think about this in Aristotle Politics 3:9, there is certainly a moral aspect of this that's very important. Now, there are 2 things about this that I think may limit exactly what's meant directly in the De Regno, however. One of these is the difference between the role of a king in particular and the end of social life, so the role of a king in pursuing peace and the welfare of the community, and the end of social life in this kind of total well and virtuous living. I think there's a lot of space for differences between ends and means here, exactly what means are appropriate to the pursuit of that end by the king. The ones that Thomas usually refers to have to do with resources, with law, with things like this, but I don't think they go as far as people want them to go sometimes. And I think part of the reason for this is the difference between, for example, the kind of city that Aristotle's talking about in the Politics, a 4th century polis, and the sort of political community that existed in the 13th century, much larger, more internally complicated, all kinds of civil society groups that exist, not as many as we have today, but very many more than would have existed in a Greek city. And I think that entails a different way of talking about the common good. It's also the case that in Aristotle, there's really no moral horizon that's beyond the polis, beyond the city. That's really the whole thing for him, whereas the stakes of politics are quite lower once Christianity comes along, and certainly in Aquinas. So I think the details, as I say, about the De Regno, about the means, are fairly limited. I'm not going to go into it. I do have in the paper, there is a disagreement on this point that I talk about that has to do with the interpretation of the De Regno that's in John Finnis's book on Aquinas, and Michael Pekalik, who's written an article critical of that. But I'm going to leave that aside and just go to my conclusion. For all the reasons that I've given, I think these two practical works illustrate something about the common good that's important. What Thomas says here about the common good and the way that it's discussed by him is, I think, not so alien from the politics that we would understand. I think his way of talking about it is certainly much closer to what we have than Aristotle's way of talking about it would have been. And a lot of that has to do with the nature of the politics of the modern state. I think Aquinas' world is sort of in between ours and that one, but I think it's closer to ours. Secondly, I think this suggests that the Catholic social teaching formulation that comes about in modern times is in fact not nearly as deviant from Thomas's views as is sometimes thought. I would characterize it as a development of those views. It especially has to do with the character and the changes of the modern state. So I think what critics of that and what critics of modern liberalism want from Aquinas is, I think there's less there than is sometimes thought in terms of a way of specifically infusing a kind of metaphysical substance into our politics. And I think ultimately that has to do with what politics is. Okay, thank you.
So we have 8 or 9 minutes of questions for Professor Lewis, and then 15 minutes for discussion. I'll keep the queue.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful for me. It sounded like you were saying that the distinction that's often made between, by Thomas, between this like metaphysical, cosmic common good that's got unity and all that sort of thing, and then much more mundane common goods, like maybe would be the subject of distributive justice, isn't as like central for Aquinas as a lot of people might think. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but if I got that right, then would you say that, so when Aquinas is talking, right, he talks frequently about how, right, the common good takes primacy over individual goods. Would that be then more because it is the common good of the multitudes? Like, is it the multitude that's giving it that primacy, or is it still the kinds of goods themselves that would be the root of that, or does that vary?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, so that it is a again, in Aristotle, you know, where there's more about this than in any other ancient author, and it's funny, I mean, in both Albert and Thomas, often texts that have to do with the common good, when they refer to Aristotle, they refer to, for example, the business in the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says that it's great to pursue happiness as an individual, but it's more divine when you do it for a whole city. Or also Nicomachean Ethics 1:6, where he's talking about the analogy of the good in Plato and common goods and other goods there. And then in Metaphysics, what is it, Metaphysics Lambda, where there's the discussion of the separate common good and the intrinsic common good of the universe. Those are not the places you would expect to look in Aristotle, to sort of think about what the common good is doing as a kind of work in Aristotle. That mostly would be in Politics 3, Nicomachean Ethics 5. Those are the places where he really talks about it. And there it's, you know, it's the community rather than simply the ruler and his friends. So the multitude part is it. Now, in Thomas, I think it also does have to do with the goods. You know, there are various places where he simply says, well, the common good, that's the good that's most good for most people, and in a certain respect, that's happiness. That's happiness. Now, obviously, the government can't make anybody happy. But happiness does require equipment. It requires conditions, and governments can have a lot to do with that. And which is part of the reason I think the sort of Vatican II formulation of the common good as a set of conditions is not nearly as nefarious as some people do. I just think that's what government does for the most part. It's about conditions. Now, there is a sense in which there is this sort of extended, ultimately the common good for human beings, the good that's most good for most people is the object of happiness, which is God. Well, the government has nothing to do with that. It can't give you the beatific vision. So that's why I'd say it's both, I think.
So I had a question about, and you alluded to it in your reference to the Finis-Picolic debate, and that is, to what extent are you taking a kind of instrumentalist reading of the common good in Aquinas? Is the solus and the pax that the king is intended to promote a strict means to the end of virtue, or is it the promotion of virtue through making laws that habituate us to the acquisition of virtue? So if you could just elaborate a little bit more on your reading, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot involved in that, actually. There are people who've criticized, again, the Vatican II formulation as being an instrumental view of the common good. I think if you read, like, if you sort of look up every reference to the common good in the Catechism and all the Vatican II documents, which I have done, it's clear that it's not instrumental, right? I mean, and it's so, for example, there's the common good of the church, in addition to being a common good of political community. God is a common good. Virtue is a kind of common good. So there's all kinds of things referred. Now, the political common good, I think itself cannot simply be understood as instrumental, although a lot of it is. A lot of the things that have to do with the political common good are instrumentally good, but not all of it. So something like, when Tom Hibbs, for example, is talking about solidarity, part of the time I'm thinking about sort of civic friendship, as Aristotle would talk about it, and sometimes Thomas. I think that's a part of the common good, but it's certainly not instrumental. Something like the rule of law, there are debates about that, but I think in the end that's probably not instrumental either. Now, John Finnis, in certain of his publications in between natural law and natural rights, and sometime around 2012, 2013, actually there were places where he said it's instrumental. He always qualified that as political common good, but since at least 2013, he's kind of stopped talking that way and said, no, that's misleading. I shouldn't have said that. I think I said that myself in a publication that I've now repudiated. I absolutely think it's not simply instrumental, although it does include a lot of things that are. So, last thing I'll say about it, Pius XII in the encyclical he wrote at the beginning of World War II, I'm blanking on the name of it at the moment, Summi Pontificatus, actually says that the state is a quasi-instrumentum. And John Paul II in Centesimus Annus says that Leo XIII held that the state was instrumental. Leo XIII never said the state was instrumental. I take that to mean that Catholic social teaching is a developing thing and that Pius XII is a part of the development and we can assimilate the whole thing. And since he said it's instrumental, okay, I think that's maybe what he meant. We can interpret it that way. Maritain said the state was instrumental. So I would say the same thing. I would say the state is instrumental. Instrumental to what? To the common good.
You mentioned the difference between thinking about a polis for Aristotle and then the size of scale in the medieval, and that we obviously much more complex. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the common good with respect to scale, and to what extent can we speak of a common good, for example, like the United Nations or international agreements, or even in federalism, in thinking on the level of 300 million people. And so, yeah, how do we think of the common good in different levels of government that might be more about the means? Maybe the end is the same for all, but what's appropriate? And also in part because a lot of this, because of social breakup, would be that the common good is often focused more in social groups that are not strictly bound by law. I think going back to Tom's paper, families and communities and neighborhoods, sometimes ethnic, sometimes religious, in which the common good is much more central in forming the way that they live, and the government's role is more of a hands-off one than Aristotle would have certainly envisioned. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the shortest possible answer would be to say the bigger you get, the thinner it gets. Right, in the sense of how whoever's charged, right, with working for the common good at that level can do. So again, if we say, well, the common good is happiness in some sense, right? Your family is a lot closer to anything that contributes to your happiness than the city or the county or the state and the university more than the American Association of University Professors or some other communist conspiracy. Kidding about that. Now, again, the social teaching documents, do talk about a universal common good, an international common good. And I take it there is such a thing, absolutely. I mean, there's international law, which I think really is law, and it has to do with the kind of order that we would like to see in the community of nations. It doesn't have the same efficacy as order within nations, but you know what? The order within nations didn't have that efficacy, 400 or 500 years ago. So, but I do think the sort of concrete pursuit of it, the various institutions and rules, they're thinner the further up you go, but I don't see any reason to think there's no common good at all of those levels.
Right, so now we're going to move to the final portion, so 15 minutes of shared discussion. Questions can be directed to anyone. Do I still want to start with this question here? And just go ahead, get your hands up, and I'll try to keep a queue.
Thank you very much. Sort of sticking with the theme, I suppose, with Dr. Lewis's presentation, with the idea that the state is an instrumental good, is it because, sort of in a McIntyrean way, common goods are always the object of practice, and so it's the body politic or community itself that is ordered to the common good, and so the institution or state is a sort of tool or instrument that the body politic or community uses to seek the common good? Is that sort of in the background?
Yeah, does this work? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I would hesitate to simply endorse that way of talking about it of McIntyre, because he at times says that politics itself is a practice, and also that the common good cannot be instantiated in the modern state. And I don't agree with that. I certainly think it can, but I do think it's thinner than it would be with respect to a particular practice or the kind of local community that he has in mind. I mean, I think the issues about the modern state have to do, you could give I think that there's two different ways to think about the modern state. One of them is a kind of empirical, phenomenal description of it, and the other has to do with its moral justification. So at one level, the modern state, it's kind of what Max Weber said it was, right? It's bureaucracy and a large territory where somebody has a monopoly on the legitimate use of coercive force, and there's bureaucratic power as distinct from charismatic or traditional authority. It's rational legal authority through a bureaucracy. That's the way modern states operate, but they're also justified in a particular way. I think almost universally in modern political philosophy, the justification of the modern state is simply the will of the population. That sort of starts with Hobbes and goes all the way through John Rawls. And I think, again, from any Catholic view, that's not acceptable, that ultimately that authority can only come from God, and it has to somehow be mediated right into the use of a particular official using coercive authority or whatever, but it has to start there. But I do think the dominant self-understanding of the modern state is those things. So I think it could only be instrumental for those reasons. Now, again, I think if you sort of understand it in the right way and kind of put it in its place, because there's no getting rid of it, right? The only thing worse than having a modern state is not having one, right? You don't want to live in Lebanon. You don't want to live in Sudan. You don't want to live in Haiti right now. So you have to have one. The point is it has to be disciplined. It has to be limited. It has to be organized in a certain way. So.
Just keeping on theme, I guess, for Professor Lewis. I, not too long ago, heard a talk, I think it was by Andrew Fisher, who made a compelling case that Aristotle really doesn't have a notion of the common good that matches what we seem to mean when we talk about it. He points out that Aristotle's example of the common good are things are at least things that that are clearly not final ends or final goods, ultimate goods. They're rather means to those ends. His example being like a ship, you know, a crew on a ship works towards a final or towards a common good, but that common good or the good that each of them as individuals gets is not common, it's individual. They get paid at the end of their journey. And he made the case that, you know, Aristotle really doesn't anywhere talk about this sort of idea of a common good as anything that isn't simply a sort of means to an individual good. So I guess on that note, you know, what would what would a common good even be in terms of like a ultimate good, and what would it mean for us to work for it? Because I can understand that we each have a final good that is such as, say, the beatific vision, but that doesn't really seem. But what's the question might be raised? What's common about that? There doesn't seem to be anything common about that for me to have the beatific vision and for you to have the beatific vision, at least not obviously so.
Well, it's good for everyone.
Yeah, but not as common, right? Only as individual.
Well, I think it is. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's the nature of the good to be diffusive, and it's the good for everyone, and there's a participation in it by all of those persons. And what is it that Thomas says that people in heaven, you know, you're not relating to people necessarily, but you know people are there, and there is a kind of community that exists within that. So I certainly, in the way that Thomas talks about it, that is a common good, precisely because it is the highest good of its kind, and it's good for everyone. I mean, in Aristotle, again, he's a little bit like Thomas. There are two phrases that are used you know, interchangeably. There's to koinon agathon, which would be literal common good, but then there's to koinon symphoron, which is actually, he uses more than that. And he does say, I mean, as Randy Smith said, I mean, the object of general justice in Nicomachean Ethics 5 is the common good of the city, in that case, the political community.
Do you mind if I say something? I mean, just to use an example, I suppose, right? The state, as it were, the political community, we might say with Maritain, the state is the governmental, whatever the sort of system is that is meant to kind of govern the political community, right? So that's the problem with using the term state, right? Because then that has a certain connotation. But we might say within the political community, within the polis, if we want to, anyway, there need to be families, right? Families are a good thing. Families lead to human flourishing. Families are good for individual flourishing. Then the question is, look, the political community can't make families, right? I mean, this is, I think, something, again, Brad was saying, but with regard to God or whatever. But, you know, you can't make families, but the state can do things to make it more possible to facilitate having families and keep bad things from happening so that families become impossible, right? So not having policies that are destructive of families and having policies that facilitate people having families, but not everyone will have a family, right? You could say the same thing about monasticism. You could say the same thing about churches. You could say, you know, the life of the moral and intellectual virtues. What would be a community which would make that more possible versus a community which might be more destructive of that, of the moral and intellectual virtues? Take a university, for example, as something destructive of the moral intellectual virtues. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, never mind. All right.
Randy, I had a question for you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Kenneth Pennington, a canon lawyer at Catholic University of America, he has argued, I believe it might be a white paper or a published paper, I'm not sure, but he says that there's vacillation in Thomas on natural lex, natural use. That Thomas goes back and forward, and it's hard to decipher clear categories on right, natural right, and natural law. But your presentation seems to present these categories as defined and clear in Thomas. So I'm wondering, would you disagree with Pennington's thesis that there's a vacillation there in Thomas? And he also, puts it in a greater context and says that compared to the jurists of the 13th century, Thomas is not using as much specificity as the jurists in his culture.
Yeah, I hate to say Thomas vacillates. This always suggests usually we're not clear about what he's saying. However, I would, this is a bigger kind of issue in the sense that, here, let me give you, back up and give you an example. In all of Peter Lombard's sentences, he uses the term jus naturale, right? This is the book, which is the, twice, neither of which really has anything to do with what we would consider to be natural law. Okay, so it's just not of interest to anyone other than the jurists up until the beginning of the 13th century, and then really only because of Maimonides' influence, right? That's what I would say. So anyway, but all of Peter Lombard twice. In Thomas's commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, it shows up 75 times, something like that. Okay, so, and here, I'm trying to work my way through, I haven't gotten quite there yet. Anyway, the point is that, is Thomas really clear on the distinction he wants to make between those two things? I'm not sure about. So if Pennington means like, yeah, like if you compare this text from that text, is he always clear on this? It seems to me the answer is maybe not, right? But I would also point to the fact that in Albert's Summa de Bono, he is the one who makes a very clear distinction between use and lex, right? And anyway, so the point is, I think by the time you get to later writings of Aquinas, he's kind of worked this out in his head in certain ways, right? Anyway, that's, I guess, what I would say as a general principle on that.
So I was thinking over the three papers. So we've got three topics here: common good, justice, solidarity. So I have a question of that sort of genre that goes, here's a false dichotomy, pick. So does common good, does it go with justice, or does it go with solidarity, or could that be a false dichotomy?
I'd like to answer that. False dichotomy. And next question. No.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Randy.
Yeah.
John. I think, well, of the things that Aquinas talks about, solidarity itself literally is not one of the things that he talks about. So what I was attempting to do was to put Aquinas in conversation with contemporary conceptions of solidarity. But I think it involves, as Brad said, civic friendship, but it's something beyond. It's thinking of the question I was asked about procedures. It strikes me that you wouldn't want to leave the responses of solidarity simply to personal, spontaneous responses. So you start to build up procedures, practices, maybe laws, institutions, and then you're shading over into the common good as embodied in a set of institutions, instrumental in one sense, right, to people flourishing, but also substantive in another, because we do share goods together that are desired for their own sake in those institutional arrangements. So what I try to do in the paper is to set out which virtues in Aquinas are actually relevant, and then I talk a little about those as instantiating the common good as a way of engaging with contemporary accounts of solidarity. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, actually, to push on, I mean, Aquinas, I don't think it's the same, but I think this is more serious than, under justice you find liberality, which isn't liberalism in our sense, but you know, like the kind of, as Joseph Pieper says, something like this, the kind of lubricant which lubricates society, which isn't strictly speaking necessary, where you say hello to people, you greet people nicely, whatever. And that, of course, can get, and I think does get, embodied in certain kinds of practices in societies. And I don't think that would make solidarity exactly, but you could think of it as, you know, in other words, solidarity is something, again, that's related to justice, but then also, yeah.
It's the form of ordinary daily solidarity that James Hunter's talking about.
Yeah, right. Anyway, does that help whoever asked that question? Right, so these things are included under justice, but in not in the same rigorous way, so that, you know, again, if you don't say hello, you're not kind to people, it doesn't destroy the peace of society necessarily, but it doesn't make society, you know, pleasant and nice in any important way.
We'll thank our panel. We'll reconvene in 20 minutes for a keynote across the way.